Friends, good evening. Father Frank Pavone here, National Director of Priests for Life. Thank you for joining my nightly broadcast. Tonight is one of the nights when we are discussing a book, one of the 9 books or so that I encourage you strongly to read between now and Election Day. We've placed that book, the list on our website. We've sent it out via email. And here on these programs, as we've discussed, each week, we're going to take one of these books and talk about it. Hopefully you've been able to read it. Let me know if you have read this one, For God and Country by Ralph Reed. The subtitle is The Christian Case for Trump. We'll discuss the book. I'll lay out a few of the key themes. Look forward to, if you've read it, to your comments about it. Next week we'll do a different book and another one each week until Election Day, and I'll let you know in advance what they are. Next week's book is The Catholic Case for Trump by Austin Ruse, and all of these you can find right there on Amazon.com. The Catholic Case for Trump by Austin Ruse. This one here is The Christian Case for Trump. So we'll get into our discussion about this, but let's begin, as usual, with a little reflection and prayer from Pro-Life Reflections for Every Day. And let's see, we're here now already on the 16th of September. All right, Matthew 7:27. The winds blew and buffeted that house, and it collapsed with a great crash. Reflection. Pro-abortion politicians will say to us, abortion is just one of many issues. I embrace a consistent ethic of life. Well, the foundation of a house is only one part of the house, but it's essential to build the other parts. That is why the bishops have taught that the right to life is the foundation of all human rights, and that our priority must be fighting abortion. Let us pray. Lord, you warned against building our house on sand. May the right to life itself shape all our other efforts for justice. Amen. ProLifeReflectionsForEveryday.com is where you can order that book. Okay, you ready to discuss For God and Country? The Christian Case for Trump. Ralph Reed is an evangelical, one of the nation's top political experts. He really is. Still a relatively young man. And Ralph has headed up the Christian Coalition, and now he heads up something called Faith and Freedom Coalition. And he and I are often together at various meetings, and we're in communication as we go through this election cycle. His Faith and Freedom Coalition has a marvelous plan for mobilizing voters across the country. They are making phone calls to persuadable voters. They are training people that go knocking on doors, and because it's person-to-person, face-to-face contact with voters, and this is true for you and for me. That is the biggest influence on them as we approach voting season, not just Election Day, voting season, because the process of at least absentee ballots is already underway now as we speak. So we've basically got 6-7 weeks of voting now in front of us. So Faith and Freedom Coalition under Ralph Reed, they're getting people out there and organizing these voters. In this book, you see it's a fairly thick book. What are we talking about? 360 pages. Ralph makes the Christian case for Trump. He equips you to answer the question, how can a Christian vote for Donald Trump? Or should a Christian vote for Donald Trump? The way he goes about it is a combination of history, political history, and his own personal knowledge of Donald Trump. He knew him before. In fact, Donald Trump reached out to Ralph Reed when he was seriously considering a run for the presidency. He had been toying with the idea since the 1980s. And But, as 2012 approached, and then, of course, the election season of 2016, Donald Trump decided it was time to run. And he had always said, if I do run, during all those years, during all those decades when the idea was in his mind, should I do this? Because he always had his thoughts of how to build America and make America better. He said, if I do, I'm going to do it when I know that I can win. He had never run for public office, and he won the highest office in the land. That's a pretty big compliment for a person's ability to get things done. And he has shown that ability to get things done throughout his almost 4 years as president. These are the kind of things Ralph looks at. He looks at his personal, it's a very fascinating book to read because Ralph gives his personal observations of Donald Trump as a man and as a Christian, and he intersperses them with his analysis in working on past presidential campaigns, looking at some of the differences with the Trump campaign, the first Trump campaign, and now the second one, and combines that with his knowledge of Christian history and of the Christian mindset. Now, he knows the evangelical world from the inside. He knows the Catholic world too, and has a great appreciation of Catholicism, but of course, much more familiar with what happens in evangelical circles. And so you'll learn a lot about that. So the intersection of the religious mindset, American political history, and his personal knowledge of Donald Trump. All of these streams come together in this particular book. And thank you. As we're going along here, I see your comments, and some of you are recommending some other excellent books, and I really appreciate that, and we'll mention those here as we go along. In the beginning of the book, as I say, he equips the reader to make a defense for supporting President Trump, because there are, a lot of our fellow citizens, and some of them are really deceived by Democrat ways of thinking, but others are, sincerely asking, well, how can a Christian, what is the Christian case for supporting Donald Trump? And what Ralph begins to do, and he returns to this theme at various points during the book, is that he points out how history, biblical history and American and world history, are filled with people who were excellent leaders for the times that they were in. They were the kind of people needed for the job that had to be done, and yet, personally, they had their flaws. He mentions, for example, Oskar Schindler. Remember Schindler's List? The man is celebrated as a hero for all the lives he saved, right? No, he was a notorious philanderer and a Nazi spy. We don't think of that. We think about his heroism. He was in the right place at the right time, and he did the right thing. There is no such thing as a political savior, but there are people who are the right political people for that time. Let me read what he says here at the beginning of his book, for example, about how the civil rights leaders, Christians, Martin Luther King Jr., right? And of course, he had his flaws too. We could talk with Alvita about that, his niece who works with us right here at Priests for Life. He reflects on the civil rights movement. Now, these were Christians. These were people who gathered in their churches before they went out and marched, who gathered and prayed before they went and sat at the lunch counters where they weren't supposed to sit, or before they went out and demanded their right to vote. These were Christians praying in their churches. And what did they do? They appealed to God, but then they appealed to Congress, and they appealed to the White House, and they appealed to the governors. Because they were in the business, and they set their minds and their hands to the task of restoring the rights of their community. Their rights to be treated equally in the public services available in America. Their rights to be served at lunch counters and attend universities and vote. Their rights. Notice, the focus was we need to secure our rights. So if the people in Congress or the people in the White House or the people in the governor's mansion were going to be able to give them those rights, that is what mattered. And that was a godly thing, because those rights and that equality that they wanted recognized under the law is something given to us by God. And what does our declaration say? That governments are instituted to secure those rights. So let me read a paragraph here of Ralph's book. He says, African American Christians sought the assistance of flawed and imperfect allies, including President Lyndon Johnson. Johnson was a corrupt man who profited from his public service, a known philanderer who was unfaithful to his wife, a crude man who used racial epithets and profanity, sometimes forcing aides to meet with him in the bathroom, a former segregationist, a protege of Georgia Senator Richard Russell Jr., the leader behind the Southern Manifesto, which sought to deny equality to black Americans. But for all his flaws and past racist views, Johnson became a champion for civil rights as president. African American Christians joined with him as U.S. citizens, seeking civil rights, which required civic action as political actors. Now, he's using this as one of many examples that he gives, and he uses this as a framework for us evaluating our current political choices and our current political activities. Because it's not a matter of Christians responding to the political choices they have based on the personal merit or the religious or moral virtues of the man or woman that is seeking their vote. Again, a lot of flaws, not only of Lyndon Johnson, but of, going back in history, Abraham Lincoln, or world history, Winston Churchill, General George Patton. I mean, these were people who had such flaws. A lot of people thought they were crazy, didn't like them at all. But here's the question. Were they the right person at the right time for the right job? What Christians look at in the political arena is not who conforms most to my faith. That's not the question. That's the wrong question. We're engaging in the political arena in order to protect our rights. We're engaging in the political arena in order to make sure that those who are governing us protect us and protect the right, if we're believers, to both believe and practice our faith. So that's one of the first key points here. And President Trump, when he was candidate Trump, or actually before he jumped full force into the candidacy for president, called Ralph Reed. He knew he was a political mover and shaker, wanted to connect with him. And one of the observations that Ralph has about the president as a man is that he always noticed that he listened more than he spoke. You know the old saying about why we have 2 ears and 1 mouth, right? Listened more than he spoke. And that's still true. He's a good listener. I've seen him in meetings. Many people have seen him in meetings, been with him, and noticed how carefully he listens. And he doesn't listen just to people who are considered the elite and the experts. This is one of the great characteristics of this man who is now our president. He notices good advice wherever it comes from. Some people they'll put more weight on the advice of, well, this person is, they've been a professor, for 50 years and they're expert in their subject. Well, what about the common man or woman who might have some insight from their experience, from their own intelligence, or from God? that has something to say. President Trump listens to everyone up and down the line. Doesn't matter the source. He looks for good ideas. It's like a radar that's constantly going. That's why you often hear him say, we'll see what happens, we'll see what happens. Because he knows he's always on the lookout for good advice. Like George is saying, you saw that when he did The Apprentice. Yeah, he listened and then he made a decision. He's always got a radar going, and I think that radar reaches further and has more of a sensitivity than many people, I would say than most people in leadership. And he'll grab the good advice when he hears it. And then when he's convinced that something is the right thing to do, he'll stick to what is right, even under pressure to satisfy some interest group who might want to try to convince him to do something different. He's genuine. Some people consider him to be rough, gruff, brash, but others will look at that and say, hey, you know what? That's a sign of genuineness. It's going to tell us exactly what he thinks, and we deserve to know what he thinks. All right. Now, as his candidacy was developing, and to the surprise of a lot of people, it was not a joke. You know, he came down that elevator in 2015, and some people said this is a joke. He didn't take the candidacy seriously. But as people began to realize, well, we better take this seriously. Ralph reviews in this book how the National Review put out an issue one day about, it was called Against Trump, and they got all these different people to write in about why Trump was not a good idea. And we even had some of our strong conservative and pro-life colleagues preparing a letter, and they ultimately signed the letter, saying that we should not support Trump, and part of the concern was over his pro-life convictions, because they said, well, he wasn't always pro-life, and he wasn't. Neither were a lot of people, including people that work in the pro-life movement and are pro-life leaders today. My friend Marjorie Dannenfelser, for example, the Susan B. Anthony list, she heads up one of the largest pro-life groups and political groups, and she, like many other leaders, did not share the pro-life views, was strongly in the opposite direction for a good portion of her years. But Ralph has an interesting paragraph here where he says that he recommended against these conservative and pro-life leaders signing on to this letter against President Trump. Listen to his reasons. He said, first, Trump had converted to the pro-life cause. And I argued that as pro-life leaders, we should welcome converts to our cause. Second, the letter was not advocating on behalf of anyone. It was merely an attack on Trump. This might peel off some social conservative voters, but those votes would ricochet like billiard balls on a pool table, scattering them to various candidates on caucus night without benefiting any single Trump opponent. Negative attacks in a crowded field rarely work. And finally, I argued that Trump might well win the nomination. And to have pro-life leaders question his pro-life convictions, which I believed were genuine, might make it difficult to rebuild the bridge to Trump later on. So I find that paragraph and many paragraphs in this book indicative of Ralph's very clear and sensitive political wisdom. By the way, for those of you that are just joining us, For God and Country, The Christian Case for Trump by Ralph Reed is the book that I'm commenting on in some detail for you here tonight. And if any of you have read this book, I invite you to share your comments as well. Let me read an interesting, again, a personal observation he makes. Again, Ralph draws on his knowledge of the man himself, and he mentions here as, again, the Trump candidacy was gaining steam. One thing that struck me about Trump was that he seemed to know everyone in the worlds of business, finance, media, and politics. And when Trump gave his word, in my experience, he kept it. When I read some of the harsher descriptions of him by other prominent Christians, the portrait they painted bore no resemblance to the man I knew. I wondered, had they ever had one conversation with the man? This is important. Because I hear this from a lot of other people too. That when they first got to meet him, when they spent some time with him, and with his family, his beautiful family, they were so impressed. His kindness, his generosity. I'm from New York. I grew up just outside of New York City. And we hear a lot of stories about the random kindness and personal generosity of this man to those that he came in contact with. Again, as Ralph says, when I read some of the harsher descriptions of him by other prominent Christians, the portrait they painted bore no resemblance to the man I knew. That's so important to keep in mind. It was a different kind of campaign. This was an unorthodox campaign. It broke the mold. Let me read a few things in regard to that. Let's see. Oh, yeah, he was campaigning in Georgia, and Ralph connected with the campaign in a place called Valdosta. It was one more example, Ralph writes, of the chaos of the Trump campaign working to the candidate's advantage. The buttoned-up, paint-by-the-numbers, hierarchical political organizations in which I have spent most of my career tended to be lethargic, lumbering giants. By contrast, the Trump campaign turned on a dime, sometimes apparently at a whim. But there was a method to the madness. In this case, Trump was the first GOP presidential candidate to visit Valdosta since Ronald Reagan. By venturing below the gnat line, as Georgia politicos referred to southern Georgia, Trump was sending a message to rural and ex-urban voters that he knew who they were and wanted their votes. It was a brilliant move. And then he goes on to talk about, let me see, I marked a few passages. The people listening to his speeches and the way that he would work the crowd. He made the Christmas line. He said, Americans are going to say Merry Christmas again. The Christmas line, Ralph writes, elicited a standing ovation that seemed to last 2 minutes. When the crowd chanted, USA, 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 or Trump, 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 he would step away from the podium, slowly clapping or patting his heart to show his gratitude. On a purely anthropological level, it was amazing to witness. Now listen to what Ralph says. Unlike anything I had seen in my 40 years of political campaigns. And the bond between Trump and his audience was undeniable and almost without precedent. And we still see this happening today. There's going to be another rally. We're going to see this tomorrow night. I hope you join me tomorrow night for the rally that we're going to watch from the president. It's going to be from Wisconsin. And then Friday night, there'll be another one from Minnesota. And then Saturday night, there'll be yet another one from Fayetteville, North Carolina. And you see this dynamic every time he has a rally. There's a real bond, a real connection. That's why he won. Because the polls in 2016, a lot of them were looking at the likely voters, except that the people who came out to elect President Trump were the unlikely voters. And that's the difference. Trump had tapped into a profound sense of grievance and alienation among people of faith about the marginalization of their faith that had been brought about by liberal judges and a media that trafficked in anti-Christian bigotry. Phyllis Schlafly, whom we miss, she's now passed away, gone to her reward. She was another one of our nation's top political experts. She was Catholic. I got to know her in the final years of her life. And she really got behind Trump in a strong way. I don't know if you realize that. And absolutely, Phyllis said without hesitation when I asked if she was backing Trump. He's the closest thing, she said, that I've seen to Ronald Reagan since Reagan left the scene. Now, Phyllis was a conservative to the core. She was one of the founders of the conservative movement. She practically single-handedly kept the ERA at bay there in the 1970s. Ralph writes, I was taken aback by Phyllis's statement. She had first attended a Republican National Convention as a delegate in 1952 and had seen it all. How so? I asked. How was Trump the best since Reagan? And she said, Trump doesn't know all the issues entirely. Now this paragraph makes a crucially important point. And Catherine is pointing out, yes, there's a new chant now that has arisen. Thank you, Catherine, for pointing this out. There's a new chant now that has arisen from the crowds in President Trump's recent rallies. Have you seen it? Did you notice it? We love you. We love you. The bond that was there, as Ralph observes, right from the beginning, even in the primaries of 2016, the bond he established with his audience, has now grown to a deeper level because people have seen not only his ability to express the things they're yearning for and the things that they believe, and to show that gusto to fight for what they believe, unlike the establishment politicians who seem to be in a straitjacket. But now it's backed by the experience and the accomplishments. Carol is saying the Trump rallies are magical. I agree. The people love him. He speaks the people's language. He does. He does. That's what we need. Don't we have too many politicians who, yeah, you hear the words they say, there's sentences coming out of their mouth. You can understand the words, but you don't know what they said. And a lot of what they say is doublespeak, and it's, you're really not sure if they believe it. Well, now we see that President Trump has accomplished so much of what he's promised. He's accomplished more than what he promised. And now people are saying, we love you. That I don't know that that's ever been heard or said at political rallies before. And thank you, Ron, for your comment. He says, we love you too, Father. Thank you. But let me read this paragraph here. Trump doesn't know, Phyllis Schlafly said, all the issues entirely. He hasn't spent his life in politics. That's fine. But he's teachable, she explained. So was Reagan. When those of us who were fighting the feminists first met with Reagan, he understood communism and capitalism, but we had to educate him about the other issues. Reagan and Trump are both outsiders. They ran against the party establishment, and the party establishment opposed them. End of quote. She saw in Trump the possibility for greatness. And now again, quoting her. More than ideology or issues which can be taught, that's the main thing. It's all about the grassroots versus the establishment. And Trump is with us, not with the establishment. He's with us. If he wins, he'll listen to us, not them. That's why they chant, we love you. Because they've seen the battle unfold. They've seen the battle between him and the Washington establishment, which, by the way, Joe Biden has been part and parcel of since he was elected in 1972. I wasn't even in high school yet. Joe Biden was elected to the Washington establishment. He's been a career politician. He's been part of the swamp. He listens to the establishment. He's part of it. Donald Trump was not, is not, will never be part of the establishment. He's with us. He's with us. And he'll always be. Let me go on to a few other gems in this book. I really hope you read it. We're talking about For God and Country, A Christian Case for Trump, The Christian Case for Trump by Mr. Ralph Reed. Let's tackle this thing about, remember when that tape came out during his first campaign about these things in the past that he had terrible comments about women? Ralph Reed was looking at the video when it first came out, and he said, I noticed something in the video. Trump had stepped off the bus and extended his arm to shake the hand of the attractive young actress who greeted him. Billy Bush then asked her, aren't you going to give the Donald a hug? When she leaned to hug him, Trump quickly said, Melania says this is okay. Now, every married man knows that mentioning his wife in the presence of another woman creates a boundary. Marriage counselors teach this technique to married men and women to use in social situations involving the opposite sex. So while Trump's language had been offensive, his actual conduct towards the woman was not. And this is where we again see, whether it's Ralph or so many people I know who interact with the president, convey this so clearly and so strongly, the deep respect with which he treats women in his day-to-day life, the actual conduct. Now, let's turn to, you remember that third debate with Hillary Clinton and the whole abortion issue. This was one of the pivotal moments of the campaign. And I was part of the pro-life advisory coalition, as also with the Catholic Advisory Coalition, both in the first campaign and also now in the second. And it was October 19th. Chris Wallace of Fox News was moderating. And let me read a little bit of this. Ralph's recounting of these events, it's so easy to read and it's so informative and interesting. Wallace gave Trump the first shot at the abortion question. I want to ask you specifically, do you want the court, including the justices that you will name, to overturn Roe v. Wade, which includes, in fact, states a woman's right to abortion? Trump said, that would happen, because I am pro-life and I will be appointing pro-life judges. I would think that will go back to the individual states. So he made that point. He stood his ground when Chris repeated the question. And about Roe v. Wade being overturned, he said that will happen automatically because I'm putting pro-life justices on the court. Notice he used the term pro-life justices, past pro-life presidential candidates who did in fact appoint pro-life judges. They didn't quite put it that plainly and clearly and directly. This is what we were looking for, and he gave it to us. Okay, then Hillary Clinton speaks and says on late-term abortion, cases that fall at the end of pregnancy are often the most heartbreaking, and she would not support a ban on them. I do not think the United States government should be stepping in and making those most personal of decisions. Okay, the usual pro-abortion rhetoric, right? This was Trump's opening, and he seized it. Now, here were his words from that third debate. In the 9th month, you can take the baby and rip the baby out of the womb of the mother just prior to the birth of the baby. Now, you can say that that's okay, and Hillary can say that that's okay, and he pointed at her and then pivoted to face the audience, but it's not okay with me. Because based on what she's saying, and based on where she's going and where she's been, you can take the baby and rip the baby out of the womb in the 9th month on the final day, and that's not acceptable. End of quote. So Ralph writes, Joanne turned to me and said, I think Trump just won the election. Powerful. He wasn't always pro-life. He became pro-life because a friend of his stood firm when she was pregnant against her husband's suggestion to have an abortion. And Donald Trump observed how then that child, having been born and growing up, was the apple of their eye. And he began thinking, you know, how many beautiful children like this, so loved by their parents now that they had them, have we lost by abortion? And that was the personal, it's very often personal events in someone's life, either in their own life or in the life of a close friend, that bring them to turn around on abortion. Now, I want to analyze for you a very important argument that Ralph makes in this book. And we touched on it a little bit as we looked at the early part of the book on how God chooses flawed people to do his work. But he develops in the middle of the book, he has a chapter here called The False Charge of Hypocrisy. And let me try to summarize this for you. People will say, they've said it to me, They'll say it to the evangelical leaders who are so vocal in support of Trump. There are more evangelical leaders vocal that come out vocally in support of him. Catholics tend to be less vocal, but still there's strong support. And they will say, the critics will say, well, you people are selling your soul to the devil. You're making a deal with the devil. Because you're overlooking the president's moral faults just so that you can get political power. This is the argument. Ralph comes against this I'm going to read some paragraphs here for you. But he comes against this very, very clearly. And he says Christians, and in particular American Christians, are not looking in their vote to elect somebody who is living out the faith that they themselves are living out. That's not the criterion. You might want to use that criterion if you're choosing your pastor of your church. But if you're choosing a president of the United States, what Americans tend to do, including the most religious Americans, and I'll put myself in that category too, the way we evaluate all this is to say, well, who can fulfill the job description best? The job description of the office to which we are electing them. And that's what you want to look at. Like we saw earlier, the passage about the civil rights movement, the civil rights people were strong and prayerful Christians, but they turned to people who could help them in the White House and in the Congress who they knew that those people who were going to help them were not strong and active Christians, but they knew that they could help them. That's the point. This is not compromising our values. This is not a sign of weak moral positions. This is a sign of a healthy civic process because we're electing people to do the work of government, which includes protecting the rights of the religious believer and the good of the community. In other words, I'm not so interested that the person I vote for is living out my faith. What I want to make sure is they're going to help me live out my faith. Help me live it out. Not concerned if they live it out. Let me see if I can put this, give this to you in Ralph's words here. The people of faith who voted for Trump in 2016, and will do so again in 2020, probably even in larger numbers, are not engaged in an act of spiritual delusion or cognitive dissonance. Now again, this is one of the deepest points of the book, so let's follow this closely. They are moral actors engaged in civic action that is rich in ethical content and long-term consequences. People of faith, confronted with a less than perfect choice between two flawed candidates, chose to do all they could to protect innocent life. Like someone charging into a burning building to save a child, these voters weighed all the options, examined their consciences, prayed fervently, and then voted for the candidate who promised to defend life. Critics of conservative evangelicals know this, which is why they now dismiss abortion as mere window dressing. Ben Ho has called abortion a cudgel that evangelicals use to bludgeon liberals, wielding it to disguise their partisanship. Okay. But he misunderstood the data. This is Ralph speaking. In my work on 11 presidential campaigns, I studied public opinion survey for decades. There is nothing new or remarkable about polling data in the Trump era. With the possible exception of George W. Bush's re-election in 2004, when the war on terror was a major campaign issue, the economy consistently ranked highest for most voters, including voters of faith. This doesn't mean that abortion, religious freedom, or support for Israel are not important issues to these voters. It means that once they have sorted through the candidates based on values criteria, usually led by abortion, they then cast their ballots primarily on the economy, jobs, education, and health care. They exclude pro-abortion candidates who will deny them their First Amendment right to practice their faith, weeding them out of the field, allowing them then to vote on a wider range of issues. It also means they are not single-issue voters. Citizens of faith are thoroughly integrated into the economic and cultural life of the larger society. They don't live in trailer parks, watch only Christian television on satellite dishes, grow their own food, or read only the Bible. Most are college educated, live in the suburbs or exurbs. Many are small business owners or employees active in their local chamber of commerce or industry groups. Their worldview can best be summed up as traditional, conservative, Bible-based. They inform their views on a broad range of issues. Their pro-life position on abortion is a reflection of this worldview. It does not define it. This is a subtle but very important point. There's a whole worldview at work here. The issues are interconnected. But we have certain disqualifying ones. As I always say, if a politician can't respect the life of a little baby, how's he supposed to respect yours? But the point here, too, is that having disqualified those people, Christians are looking at a wide range of issues, again, from the point of view of policies and accomplishments, not from the point of view of personal morality of the candidate. And he uses the example of the Ronald Reagan election. I don't know how many of you were around when the choice was there to vote for him. 1980, right? Jimmy Carter was running against him. Here you had Ronald Reagan, a divorced man and former Hollywood actor, running against a man who was a devout Baptist and a Sunday school teacher. Sunday school teacher, devout Baptist. Hollywood actor, divorced. Who would you think religious Americans would tend to vote for? They gravitated towards the divorced ex-Hollywood actor. Again, because Americans factor in the job description and how well a person is suited to carry that out. Excellent. It's so important to... there's so much more here that I can go into in this book. You know, Paul, Ralph refers to Paul, you read in the Acts of the Apostles, when Paul was defending himself and defending his ministry to preach the faith, and he was under attack because his enemies were trying to stop him. You know what he ultimately did? As you get towards the end of the Acts of the Apostles, and you read about all his adventures, he appealed to Caesar. This was the Roman Empire that ended up persecuting Christians in the worst way. Paul, one of the key apostolic figures, writer of much of the New Testament, appealed to Caesar to help him and to help his ministry. That's a significant point, and Ralph brings that out. He goes in the latter part of the book. Let me just tell you a few of the other chapters that you'll see when you read this book. Really, I mean, this is great stuff. The media. He talks about the media's attacks on Trump. His pro-life and pro-family agenda. We talk about that all the time. He goes in some detail to the Brett Kavanaugh hearings. You know, it's an important point he brings out here. What was the left trying to do? They were trying to, of course, get the president to appoint a more centrist kind of judge, not quite so conservative, not quite so pro-life. They've tried to, raise hell so that, those who chose these judges will learn their lesson, so to speak. But you see, a lot of other presidents would have backed down when there was that intense pressure against Kavanaugh. President Trump stuck with him, saw him through that process. And the other thing, of course, that the Blasey Ford there and her team admitted was at play was that they wanted to make sure that should Brett Kavanaugh ever vote against Roe v. Wade in a future decision, that they would have tainted his reputation in such a way that it would indirectly taint the decision that would knock down Roe. Interesting thought. Ralph goes into that and analyzes that. But he says, really, what they're trying to do is discourage people like President Trump from appointing strong conservative pro-life judges. Well, they haven't discouraged him. You saw his list. He put out a list. And when you see people like Ted Cruz, Noel Francisco, Paul Clement, I know these guys, let me tell you, there's no question about how solid these men are. Then he talks about the Kavanaugh hearings. He has a chapter about, as he said, fake news, and the death of journalism, really great analysis. He goes into Russia, the Ukraine, and impeachment, these hoaxes, which are really attempted coups, and against the president. He goes into those things in detail. And then his final chapter is simply called 2020. And he makes the point very persuasively that the other side, the radical left, the God-rejecting, America-despising, life-destroying, faith-suppressing Democrat Party, they have been registering voters. They have been rallying their troops, brothers and sisters. This is all a numbers game. They don't care about convincing us of anything. They just want to have more votes. We have to have the same mindset. We've got to register more voters now. Ralph's book goes through all these different things. I've given you quite a bit from it here tonight. But he brings it all to a very practical conclusion. We have got to register voters like crazy, and we've got to get them out there to vote. You can register voters right now. We're working morning, noon, and night. The election is the only thing I'm working on now. Morning, noon, and night. I don't care about the objections of anybody anywhere. I have been focusing on this like a laser beam, and nothing's going to stop me from speaking out. Brothers and sisters, I know that's true of you too. And you can reach people that I can't reach, despite everything that we're doing from here. We need you to do that. Like Eric is saying, promises made, promises kept. So true. And that's what we've got to focus on. Ralph focuses on that in this book. Again, it is a great book. Carol, you're right. It is a great book. For God and Country. Look it up on Amazon. For God and Country, Ralph Reed, R-E-E-D, For God and Country, The Christian Case for Trump. He brings it to that practical conclusion to say to us, register voters. As Dale is saying, make sure you're registered. You can Google, I am registered to vote, or am I registered to vote, rather. And we've also set up a domain to make it easy called checkyourvoterregistration.com. So friends, let's do it. Let's do it in the name of Christ. Let's do it for each other and in the name of America. I really appreciate you spending this hour with me. God bless you. Next week, hopefully we'll have the author of the book, The Catholic Case for Trump by Austin Ruse, R-U-S-E. Look it up, read it. It's not as long as Ralph's book, and we'll talk to you about that book next week. Christine was recommending to us also another great book, Inside Trump's White House, The Real Story of His Presidency by Doug Weed, highlighting Trump's accomplishment and the personal, compassionate side of the president. So very true. We hear about that all the time. And also The War for America's Soul by Sebastian Gorka. And Sebastian has become a friend, and he has me on his show frequently, and just another great guy. Thanks, friends. Onward to victory. So now may the Lord bless you, strengthen you, protect you, answer all your prayers, and make you strong defenders of the unborn. May He bless you, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Carol is saying, thank you, Father, very educational show. That's what I like to hear. That's what we want to do. We want to equip you. We want to encourage you. And I'm glad that that's been the effect tonight. We'll talk to you tomorrow, friends. Have a good night.